The morning mist clung to St. Mary's Church like a reluctant mourner, refusing to dissipate even as the October sun climbed higher above the Cotswold Hills. Miss Jane Marple stood at the vicarage gate, her hands folded over the handle of her walking stick, observing the coat with the peculiar intensity that had, over 70 years, become her most reliable companion in understanding human nature. The garment hung there, as though suspended in time, its grey wool worn but not threadbare, caught on the iron finial that topped the gate like some abandoned prayer. Nobody had moved it for 3 days, which seemed to Miss Marple rather telling in itself, for in a village the size of St. Edmund's Cross, such things rarely went unnoticed or untended for long. "Dreadfully odd, isn't it?" Mrs. Pemberton had said yesterday, when Miss Marple was taking her customary morning constitutional. "Just hanging there, rain or shine. Do you suppose someone simply forgot it?" Mrs. Pemberton was the sort of woman who collected questions the way others collected china, never quite satisfied with answers, but always ready to amplify the mystery. Miss Marple had merely smiled and said that people were creatures of habit and accident in equal measure, which seemed to mollify her sufficiently. The coat, upon closer examination, bore the faint tailor's mark of Henderson's in Market Street. Miss Marple recognized the precise stitching along the seams, having purchased her own cardigan from them some years ago. The buttons were pearl, well maintained, suggesting an owner of some means. More interesting still was the faint embroidered monogram inside the collar, though the years and rain had rendered it nearly illegible. An M was discernible, perhaps, or could it be a W? Miss Marple made a mental note to investigate this more carefully when she had the proper light, though she suspected she already knew to whom the coat belonged. The vicarage itself was occupied by Reverend Timothy Ashford and his wife Margaret, a couple of perhaps 40 years who had arrived in St. Edmund's Cross only 2 years prior. The Reverend was a man of moderate sermon and considerable kindness, prone to asking about rhododendrons and the state of one's knees with genuine interest. Margaret was quieter, a woman who seemed perpetually caught between engagement and distance, as though she were perpetually waiting for a bell that had already rung. They had no children, which several villagers found noteworthy enough to mention repeatedly, though Miss Marple had observed that the absence of children rarely surprised anyone who looked carefully enough at marriages. The Ashfords kept to themselves more than the previous vicar's family had done, and St. Edmund's Cross, being a village where propriety held court like a strict magistrate, had taken note of this preference for privacy with interest bordering on suspicion. The discovery of the coat had come about quite by accident, really, when young Thomas Whitmore, who delivered the Morning Post, had noticed it on Tuesday morning. He'd mentioned it in passing to Mrs. Hartley at the post office, who had felt it her duty to mention it to the vicar himself, which she had done with a kind of delicacy that made even such a simple act feel vaguely accusatory. Reverend Ashford had seemed bemused and had retrieved the coat from the gate, only to drape it over the garden bench when he couldn't identify its owner. By Wednesday, however, the coat had disappeared from the bench and reappeared on the gate, positioned with what seemed to Miss Marple like deliberate care. She wondered at the precise angle it had been hung, the way. The sleeves draped as though arranging themselves in a silent conversation no one else could hear. Miss Marple had lived in St. Edmund's Cross for nearly 30 years, long enough to have moved from the category of newcomer to established fixture, which was the only category that truly mattered in villages such as this one. She had raised her nephew Raymond here, though he was grown now and off in London making his fortune in the law, and she had made the kinds of small, unremarkable relationships that formed the connective tissue of village life. She knew the shopkeepers and the schoolmistress, the doctor and his nurse, and she had sat through enough village council meetings to understand that the most trivial disputes often concealed profound personal grievances. Most people, she had learned, were not nearly as complicated as they believed themselves to be, but were instead reliably predictable once you understood the specific framework of their wants and fears. The coat bothered her not because it was out of place, which it manifestly was, but because of what it suggested about the person who had placed it there. Deliberate action, she thought, turning the puzzle over in her mind. Not absent-mindedness or accident, but intention. Someone had taken the trouble to return the coat to the vicarage gate, to ensure its visibility and prominence. There was a message in the gesture, though Miss Marple could not yet determine what it was meant to convey. Was it an accusation, a threat, or perhaps an apology of the sort that could not be spoken aloud. She had lived long enough to know that small villages held enormous secrets. The seemingly perfect marriages concealed infidelities and disappointments. The successful business owners had often succeeded through means not entirely transparent to public scrutiny. The respected figures of the community were rarely as virtuous as their reputations suggested. And now, with the strange matter of the coat, Miss Marple sensed the delicate equilibrium of St. Edmund's Cross shifting slightly, like a house settling on its foundations. Something was about to happen, something that would require all of her particular talents to unravel. She gripped her walking stick a little more firmly and resolved to pay closer attention to the Reverend and Mrs. Ashford in the coming days. Human nature, she had always believed, was the greatest mystery of all, and this coat was merely its latest message, waiting to be read by someone patient enough to listen to what objects and circumstances sometimes tried to tell. The vicar's study smelled of leather and old paper, with that particular mustiness that accumulated whenever books were allowed to gather undisturbed for several seasons. Miss Marple sat across from Reverend Ashford on Thursday afternoon, ostensibly having come to discuss the flower arrangements for the upcoming harvest festival, though her real purpose was somewhat more investigative in nature. The Reverend was a conscientious man, she observed, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested recent worry beneath his carefully maintained composure. His fingers drummed occasionally against the desk blotter, a gesture he seemed unaware of making, and his eyes had developed a faint wariness that suggested he was not entirely comfortable with unannounced visitors, even from long-standing parishioners such as herself. "The roses are particularly beautiful this year," Miss Marple ventured, having noticed them in the garden as she'd walked up the vicarage path, "though I imagine Mrs. Ashford must be kept quite busy maintaining them. She has such an eye for gardening." This was partly true and partly a gentle fishing expedition, for Miss Marple had noted on several occasions that Margaret Ashford spent consigned Rabel time in the garden, often standing quite still for extended periods, her hands idle despite the abundance of work that gardens perpetually demanded. Reverend Ashford nodded, though something flickered across his face. A momentary shadow that suggested the mention of his wife had touched upon some tender subject. "Margaret is indeed devoted to the roses," he said carefully. "Perhaps more devoted than is strictly necessary, if I may say so. She finds peace there, I think. Women need their outlets, don't you find?" The question was posed with a directness that felt slightly off-key, as though he were reading from a script he had recently learned. "Devoted people are often the most interesting," Miss Marple observed mildly, smoothing her skirt over her knees. "I've always thought that the things we devote ourselves to reveal far more about our characters than any amount of conversation might. Tell me, Reverend, have you given any further thought to the matter of the coat? It is a peculiar business, isn't it?" She watched his reaction carefully, noting how his hand stilled on the desk and how his jaw tightened fractionally. "The coat," he repeated, as though hearing the word for the first time. "Yes, well, a most vexing mystery. I've examined it more closely now, and I believe it may have belonged to someone from the village, though I cannot imagine how it came to be abandoned at the gate. Perhaps a visitor left it behind, or someone was caught in the rain and sought shelter here momentarily." The explanation was reasonable enough on the surface, but Miss Marple detected the rehearsed quality to it, as though he had prepared this answer in advance of being asked. "How very logical," Miss Marple said, though she made a small sound of consideration. "And yet, doesn't it seem rather deliberate to you? The way it was hung so carefully on the finial, positioned just so. My experience, people who are caught in the rain and seek shelter do not take the time to arrange their coats with such precision. They simply abandon them in haste, wouldn't you say?" She allowed her eyes to rest gently on his face, observing how a muscle worked in his temple. "It suggests intention, I think. Purpose. The sort of thing someone does when they wish to communicate something without words." Reverend Ashford rose abruptly and walked to the window, presenting Miss Marple with his back, which was itself a kind of answer. "I'm afraid I'm not particularly skilled at reading meaning into such things," he said quietly. "I tend to take most matters at face value. Occupational habit, perhaps. Ministers are advised to accept explanations rather than complicate them unnecessarily." Yet his shoulders had tensed visibly, and Miss Marple noticed that his hands, clasped behind his back, were trembling slightly. "Of course," Miss Marple conceded, though she did nothing of the sort, "though I wonder whether acceptance and understanding are not sometimes at odds with one another. When I was a girl, my cousin Eleanor once left her gloves at a gentleman caller's home quite deliberately, as a sign that she wished him to return them to her personally. It was rather a scandal at the time, such a breach of propriety, but the gentleman in question understood her meaning perfectly. He called round the very next day." She paused deliberately, allowing silence to expand between them. "Do you suppose the coat might have a similar significance?" The Reverend turned back to face her, and Miss Marple saw clearly now what he had been hiding. Fear, pure, unadulterated fear mixed with something else, something that resembled guilt, though perhaps not in the criminal sense. "I think, Miss Marple, that we ought perhaps to discuss the flower arrangements now," he said firmly. "Margaret has expressed a preference for dahlias this year, though I personally prefer something simpler. What would you recommend?" The subject change was so abrupt as to be almost comical, and yet Miss Marple recognized it as a kind of capitulation. He was asking her, through his very refusal to continue the conversation, to drop the matter. But she filed away everything she had observed: his nervousness, his prepared explanation, his fear, and most significantly, his apparent conviction that the coat belonged to someone in the village, which he had not actually said but which had been implicit in every evasion. After she left the vicarage, Miss Marple made her way to the cottage of Mrs. Eleanor Webb, who had once been a seamstress and now lived in comfortable retirement with an impressive collection of needlework and an even more impressive network of information. Eleanor had made the school uniforms for nearly 30 years and had therefore developed intimate knowledge of every family in the vicinity. She was currently engaged in embroidering a tea-cloth when Miss Marple arrived, and she looked up with the pleasure that generally greeted any interruption to her needlework. "Eleanor, dear, I wonder if you might help me with a small mystery," Miss Marple said, settling into the offered chair. "I've been trying to identify the owner of a grey coat, Henderson's tailoring, pearl buttons, and what I believe to be a monogram inside the collar. It's a quality garment, well maintained." "Does it suggest anyone in particular to you?" She watched Eleanor's nimble fingers pause in their work, watched the slight flush that crept up her neck, watched the way her eyes slid toward the window. "Grey coat?" Eleanor said slowly. "Well, that could be almost anyone, couldn't it? Though—" She hesitated, and in that hesitation, Miss Marple found exactly what she had been looking for. "Though I suppose it could belong to Catherine Hartwell. She has a coat rather like that, or at least she did before she left the village last spring. But that's hardly relevant now, is it? She's been gone nearly 6 months. Why on earth would her coat be hanging on the vicarage gate?" Eleanor's voice had taken on an edge of alarm, and Miss Marple understood that she had just accidentally uncovered something far more significant than a simple abandoned garment. Catherine Hartwell had been the previous vicar's housekeeper, and according to all available intelligence, she had left quite suddenly one evening and had not been seen since. The village had been full of speculation at the time, but eventually the gossip had settled into accepted history. Catherine had found other employment elsewhere, as young women did, and life in St. Edmund's Cross had continued undisturbed. But now, it seemed, Catherine Hartwell's coat had returned to the village, and with it came questions that nobody quite wanted answered. The market square of St. Edmund's Cross was quieter than usual on Friday morning, though Miss Marple suspected this had more to do with the unexpected rain than with any particular shift in the village's rhythm. She stood beneath the awning of the post office, ostensibly waiting for the weather to clear, though her real purpose was to observe the comings and goings of her fellow villagers, and to note their reactions when she carefully steered the conversation toward Catherine Hartwell. Mrs. Hartley, the postmistress, was a woman of formidable memory and even more formidable opinions, and she had already provided Miss Marple with considerable information without quite realizing that she was doing so. "Catherine Hartwell," Mrs. Hartley had mused, her fingers pausing over the sorting rack. "Now there's a name I haven't heard in some time. Poor girl. She seemed rather lost when she first aimed to work for the old vicar, but she settled in well enough. At least, she appeared to. though you can never really know what goes on in people's heads, can you? She left rather abruptly, if I recall correctly. No proper notice given, just up and went one evening. The vicar at the time, Reverend Blackwell that was, before the Ashfords came, he seemed quite put out about it, though I suppose he managed well enough with the temporary arrangement. Mrs. Hartley had lowered her voice conspiratorially. Some said she'd taken up with a fellow from the next village over, but I never did credit that particular rumour. Catherine was a good girl, respectable, not the sort to go running off without a word unless something rather significant had occurred. Now, as Miss Marple watched the rain continue its steady descent, she found herself constructing a timeline in her mind. Catherine Hartwell had left the village in the spring, approximately 6 months ago. The Ashfords had arrived in the summer, perhaps 2 months after Catherine's departure, which was itself an interesting coincidence, though Miss Marple had learned long ago to be cautious about coincidences. They rarely occurred naturally. They were usually constructed by human design, though the designers themselves were often unaware of the architecture they were creating. The coat had appeared on the Vicarage gate 3 days ago, on a Tuesday morning, and had been deliberately returned to the gate the following day after the vicar had moved it. Someone wanted the Ashfords, or perhaps specifically Reverend Ashford, to see that coat. Someone wanted them to remember Catherine Hartwell. But who, and more importantly, why? Miss Marple purchased her usual packet of needles and a ball of knitting yarn, chatting pleasantly with Mrs. Hartley about the upcoming harvest festival and the state of her roses. As she left the post office, she made a mental note to visit the library, where Miss Catherine Morris, the librarian, kept meticulous records of the village's comings and goings, not in any official capacity, but simply because she made it her business to note such things. Miss Morris was the sort of woman who remembered when people arrived in the village, how long they stayed, and precisely what circumstances attended their departure. She would have information about Catherine Hartwell that might prove illuminating. The library was a converted cottage on the outskirts of the village green, small but well organized, with the particular quiet that only libraries possessed. Miss Catherine Morris looked up from her desk as Miss Marple entered, and her face brightened with that genuine pleasure that librarians seem to reserve for regular patrons with predictable reading habits. Miss Marple had come to the library faithfully for nearly 30 years, always borrowing mysteries and biographies, creating in Miss Morris's mind the impression that she was a woman of considerable intellectual curiosity, which was not entirely inaccurate, though her curiosity tended to be more practically focused than Miss Morris perhaps realized. "Miss Marple," Miss Morris said warmly, "how delightful. I've just received a new Agatha Christie. I thought of you immediately. Shall I reserve it for you?" Miss Marple demurred politely, and instead asked if Miss Morris had any records regarding previous residents of the village. This was a rather direct approach, but Miss Marple had found that directness, when tempered with sufficient graciousness, often yielded better results than elaborate subterfuge. "Previous residents?" Miss Morris looked slightly taken aback. "Well, I don't keep official records, of course, but I do maintain a rather extensive card index of villagers and their histories. It began as a private project. You understand, but I've found it quite useful when recommending books. People's tastes are often informed by their circumstances, and understanding their circumstances helps me assist them more effectively." She rose and retrieved a wooden filing box from beneath her desk. "Is there someone in particular you're interested in?" "Catherine Hartwell," Miss Marple said. "I believe she worked as a housekeeper for Reverend Blackwell until she left the village some months ago. I'm trying to recall the particulars of her employment and departure. My memory isn't quite what it once was, you understand. This was a deliberate misdirection, for Miss Marple's memory was in fact quite formidable, and she knew it. But people were more willing to share information when they believed they were assisting someone whose faculties were declining, rather than someone conducting an investigation." Miss Morris withdrew a card from her file box and studied it thoughtfully. "Catherine Hartwell," she read aloud. "Arrived in the village in March of last year. Employed as housekeeper by Reverend Blackwell. She came from Manchester, according to the information I gathered. She was perhaps 25 or 26 years old, quiet, kept very much to herself. And then—" Miss Morris paused, her finger trailing down the card. She left in early May of this year, quite suddenly. There was some speculation at the time about her departure, though nothing was ever confirmed. I noted that she seemed increasingly distressed in the weeks preceding her departure, though I had only limited contact with her, so I cannot say this with absolute certainty. "Distressed?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "In what way?" "Well," Miss Morris set down the card and folded her hands thoughtfully. She seemed anxious, watchful. "I saw her on several occasions in the village, and she always appeared to be looking over her show." Elder, as though she expected someone to approach her. "And there was an incident at the library, about a week before she left. She came in rather agitated and asked me whether I knew of any employment opportunities in other villages or towns. She seemed desperate for work that would take her away from St. Edmund's Cross. I recommended she speak with the vicar about references, but she seemed reluctant to do so, which I found curious. When she left, it was quite abrupt, and I never did learn where she went or whether she found the employment she was seeking." Miss Marple thanked Miss Morris for her assistance and borrowed the promised Agatha Christie, though her mind was only partially engaged with the transaction. She was thinking instead about Catherine Hartwell, about a young woman who had arrived in the village seemingly unremarkable and who had departed under circumstances that suggested distress and perhaps even fear. She was thinking about the coat on the vicarage gate, and about Reverend Ashford's nervous tension when the garment had been mentioned. Most of all, she was thinking about the curious timing of events, Catherine's departure and the Ashfords' arrival, separated by only a few weeks. In Miss Marple's experience, such temporal proximity rarely occurred without significance. It was as though someone had carefully orchestrated a sequence of departures and arrivals, removing one piece from the village puzzle and inserting another in its place. The question was whether this orchestration had been designed to conceal something or to eventually reveal it, and the more Miss Marple considered the matter, the more she suspected that the coat on the vicarage gate represented a beginning rather than an ending, a deliberate act designed to set certain mechanisms into motion, mechanisms that would culminate in some form of truth at someone desperately Waby Saturday. Morning. The news of the returned coat had begun to circulate through St. Edmund's Cross with the inevitable momentum of village gossip, though it had undergone certain transformations in its journey from person to person. Some versions suggested that the coat had belonged to a travelling salesman who had met with foul play on the road. Others proposed that it was evidence of a lover's quarrel, that some romantic entanglement had reached its dramatic conclusion on the very doorstep of the vicarage itself. Mrs. Pemberton had gone so far as to suggest in the hearing of at least a dozen parishioners that the coat might have belonged to someone who had simply vanished without explanation, and the coat had been left as a kind of memorial or warning. Miss Marple observed these various theories with the particular interest of someone who understood that gossip, however distorted, often contained kernels of truth that could be excavated with sufficient patience and care. She had taken it upon herself to visit the church rectory where the coat had been temporarily stored in a cupboard by Reverend Ashford, with the half-formed intention of eventually returning it to its owner, an action that suggested he knew precisely whose coat it was, but was uncertain how to proceed. The vicar had been somewhat reluctant to allow Miss Marple access to the garment, but her request was phrased as a simple desire to help identify its owner, framed as an act of Christian charity, and he had been sufficiently embarrassed to refuse a parishioner of such standing. Margaret Ashford had stood nearby during this exchange, Miss Marple noted, and her expression had contained something that resembled fear, though it was swiftly masked by a smile of polite inquiry. The coat, upon closer inspection in better light, revealed considerably more than Miss Marple's initial observation had suggested. The monogore inside the collar was indeed an H, which corresponded with the surname Hartwell. More significantly, there was a small tear in the lining near the inside pocket, and within that pocket she discovered a receipt from the greengrocer dated 3 weeks before Catherine Hartwell's departure. This in itself was unremarkable, but what caught Miss Marple's attention was a second receipt, folded more carefully, which bore the notation of a hotel in Manchester and a date corresponding to the week before Catherine had arrived in St. Edmund's Cross. Catherine had come to the village from Manchester, and she had returned to Manchester, or at least to a hotel there, just days before her departure from the village. The implications of this detail were intriguing, though Miss Marple remained uncertain of their precise significance. She had positioned herself on Saturday afternoon in the tea-room of the Lamb and Crown, the village's only public house that served as an acceptable gathering place for respectable women, and she had arranged to meet Mrs. Dorothy Blackwell, the widow of the previous vicar. Dorothy had moved to a small cottage near the market town of Cheltenham after her husband's retirement, but she visited St. Edmund's Cross regularly to maintain her connections with the parish. She was a woman of excellent sense and considerable candour, qualities that Miss Marple had always appreciated, and she had consented to tea with visible pleasure when Miss Marple had extended the invitation. "Catherine Hartwell," Dorothy said thoughtfully, stirring her tea with deliberate slowness. "Yes, I remember her quite well. She came to us with reasonable references, though my husband always said there was something rather sad about her, some quality of resignation that suggested she had experienced disappointment. She was a conscientious worker, kept the house in excellent order, but he seemed to have difficulty forming connections with the villagers. She was polite but distant, as though she were observing the village from some remove rather than participating in it." Dorothy paused, lifting her cup to her lips. "Toward the end of her employment with us, however, things changed. She became noticeably more anxious, and on one or two occasions I witnessed her in tears, though she attempted to conceal this when she realized I had observed her. My husband attempted to speak with her about whether she was experiencing some difficulty that he might assist with, but she insisted that everything was perfectly satisfactory, which was quite obviously untrue." "Do you have any notion of what might have distressed her?" Miss Marple asked gently. She had learned that gentle inquiry often yielded more useful information than direct questioning, for people were more inclined to elaborate when they felt their confidences were being invited rather than extracted. Dorothy set down her cup and gazed out the window toward the village green. "I have a suspicion, though I cannot claim to possess any concrete evidence. About a month before Catherine left us, a gentleman came to the vicarage one evening. He did not come to the front door, but rather to the kitchen entrance, and he appeared to be someone Catherine recognized, though not, I think, someone she was particularly pleased to see. They had a conversation in the kitchen, and though I did not deliberately listen, the tone of their voices carried sufficiently for me to understand that they were engaged in some form of disagreement. When the gentleman left, Catherine was quite distraught, and she went to her room without completing her evening tasks. The following morning, she seemed to have recovered her composure, though she was noticeably more withdrawn than before. "Did you observe this gentleman clearly anew?" "To describe him?" Miss Marple inquired, though she suspected she already knew the direction this narrative was taking. "Reasonably well," Dorothy replied. "He was of middle height, perhaps 40 years of age, with reddish hair going grey at the temples. He wore a dark suit and had the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, though not, I would say, of a clergyman or academic. He gave the impression of someone in business, or perhaps in some form of official capacity. I remember my husband thinking, after the gentleman had left, that Catherine might have had some previous connection with him that had resulted in complications. My husband was a good man, Miss Marple, but he was not particularly perceptive about the complexities of human relationship, and he did not press Catherine for information about who her visitor had been. Miss Marple absorbed this information with the careful deliberation that had served her well throughout her life. A man of middle years, in business or official capacity, with whom Catherine Hartwell had had some sort of previous connection that occasioned distress. A man who had sought her out at the vicarage, suggesting he had some knowledge of her location and employment. And then Catherine had left the village, apparently in haste, leaving behind only her coat, which had eventually been returned to the vicarage gate with a deliberateness that suggested intention. "Dorothy," Miss Marple said carefully, "I wonder if you might recall whether this gentleman who visited Catherine bore any resemblance to Reverend Ashford." Dorothy's teacup froze halfway to her lips, and a faint flush crept up her neck. "My goodness," she said softly, "I had not considered that possibility, but now that you mention it—" She set down her cup with a small clink that seemed to echo in the quiet of the tea-room. "There is a certain similarity, yes. The bearing, perhaps, or the manner of speaking, though I cannot say with absolute certainty. It was nearly a year ago, after all, and memory can be quite unreliable regarding such details. Yet her eyes held a quality of certainty that belied her disclaimers, and Miss Marple understood that Dorothy had indeed recognized Reverend Ashford, or at least believed she had recognized him, in the description of the gentleman who had visited Catherine Hartwell all those months ago. Ted exposed. The revelation that the mysterious visitor bore a resemblance to Reverend Ashford presented Miss Marple with a puzzle of considerable complexity, for it suggested a connection between Catherine Hartwell and the current vicar that predated his arrival in St. Edmund's Cross by some months. She spent Sunday morning attending the service at St. Mary's Church, ostensibly for purposes of spiritual edification, though her actual intention was observational. She watched Reverend Ashford as he delivered his sermon on the subject of redemption and forgiveness, noting how his voice took on a particular quality of intensity when he spoke about the burden of secrets and the liberation that came from confession. Margaret sat in the pew reserved for the vicar's family, her hands folded precisely in her lap, her expression one of polite attention that seemed to mask some deeper emotion. Miss Marple observed how rarely the Ashfords exchanged glances, and how, on the one occasion when their eyes briefly met across the aisle, Margaret's expression had tightened into something resembling pain. After the service, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage, where Margaret had established a habit of taking tea with select parishioners on Sunday afternoons. The gatherings were small, usually only 3 or 4 women, and they maintained a quality of formality that suggested Margaret found such social obligations somewhat tea. Today, in addition to Miss Marple, there was Mrs. Finch, whose husband owned the hardware store, and young Lucy Pritchard, who taught at the village school. Margaret poured tea with meticulous care, distributing cups and saucers with the precision of someone performing a ritual they had practiced extensively. The conversation initially remained on safe subjects: the garden, the weather, the upcoming jumble sale in aid of the church restoration fund. But as Miss Marple sipped her tea, she gradually steered the discussion toward matters more personal. "I was just speaking with Dorothy Blackwell," Miss Marple observed casually, "and she was reminiscing about Catherine Hartwell, the housekeeper who worked for Reverend Blackwell before you arrived. It seems Catherine was quite an efficient worker, though apparently she experienced some difficulties during her final months of employment. Mrs. Finch, do you remember Catherine? She used to shop at your husband's establishment occasionally, I believe." This was a strategic redirection, for Miss Marple had noted that Mrs. Finch was inclined to gossip and might be induced to provide information that Margaret herself was unlikely to volunteer. Mrs. Finch set down her teacup with evident enthusiasm. "Oh yes, Catherine Hartwell. Quiet girl, kept herself to herself. I remember she came in once looking for gardening supplies, and she purchased quite a lot of them. It seemed rather odd at the time, as I understood she was employed as a housekeeper, not as a gardener. I mentioned it to my husband, and he said he thought the vicar's wife must have wanted the supplies, though Catherine had been quite specific that they were for her own use." Mrs. Finch lowered her voice, adopting the conspiratorial tone that preceded significant gossip. And then, about a month before she left, Catherine came in again, and she appeared to have been crying. Her eyes were quite red, and she seemed distressed. I asked if she was quite well, and she insisted that she was perfectly fine, but you could tell she was not. She purchased more supplies that day, some rather unusual items for a housekeeper, I thought. Miss Marple observed Margaret's reaction to this narrative with careful attention. The younger woman had become noticeably tense, her fingers gripping her teacup with apparent force. "Gardening supplies?" Margaret said, her voice somewhat strained. "That is rather an unusual purchase for a housekeeper. I wonder what she intended to do with them." There was something in her tone that suggested more than casual interest, and Miss Marple filed away this observation with the others she had been accumulating. "Well," Mrs. Finch continued, apparently oblivious to Margaret's tension, "my husband mentioned it to someone at the market, and there was some speculation that Catherine might have been tending a private garden somewhere, perhaps as a source of income. You know how these young women can be, always trying to improve their circumstances. But then she left the village, and we never did learn what became of her or her gardening enterprises." Mrs. Finch turned her attention to her tea, seemingly satisfied that she had contributed sufficiently to the conversation. After the other guests had departed, Miss Marple remained behind on the pretext of discussing flower arrangements for the church, though her real purpose was to observe Margaret in a more private context. The younger woman's composure had visibly frayed, and she moved about the sitting room with a distracted quality that suggested her mind was occupied with matters other than floristry. Miss Marple watched as Margaret paused before the window, her gaze directed toward the garden where, Miss Marple now noticed, there were several recently dug patches of earth, as though something had been planted there and then removed. "Your garden has undergone considerable changes," Miss Marple observed mildly. "I noticed several new plantings and what appear to be recently disturbed areas. Are you planning some renovation?" She posed the question with innocent curiosity, though her eyes remained alert. Margaret turned from the window with an expression that suggested she had been caught in some transgression. "Just some clearing," she said carefully. "We inherited the garden in rather neglected condition, and we've been attempting to restore it to a more manageable state. Some areas simply did not justify the effort required to cultivate them, so we've removed them." Her explanation was reasonable enough, yet her hesitation before delivering it suggested there was considerably more to the story than she was prepared to reveal. "I see," Miss Marple said. "I hope you've not disturbed anything particularly valuable. Reverend Blackwell maintained some rather specialized plantings, I understand. Plants with medicinal properties, or so I was told. His wife mentioned that Catherine seemed quite interested in gardening during her employment here. Perhaps she was assisting with some botanical project?" This last sentence was delivered with apparent innocence, but Miss Marple watched closely for Margaret's reaction. The younger woman's face had gone quite pale, and she appeared to be struggling with whether to say something further. "I really know very little about what occurred during Reverend Blackwell's tenure here," Margaret said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "My husband has suggested that we focus our energies on the present and future, rather than dwelling on the past. I think that is wise counsel, don't you?" There was a quality of desperation in her tone, a pleading undertone that suggested this was not simply her own conviction, but rather something she had been instructed to believe, or at least to profess publicly. Miss Marple rose to depart, and as she did so, she allowed her hand to brush against a small table near the sitting-room door. Upon it sat a framed photograph of Reverend and Margaret Ashford on their wedding day, positioned prominently as though for display purposes. Yet Miss Marple's sharp eyes noticed something that had escaped the attention of more casual observers. There was a second photograph visible in the background, partially obscured, showing what appeared to be Reverend Ashford with another woman, a younger woman with dark hair. Before she could examine this more closely, Margaret noticed the direction of Miss Marple's gaze and quickly moved to adjust the framing, obscuring the background photograph entirely. "Just an old picture," she said, her voice tight. "Nothing of significance." But the very act of concealment suggested that it was, in fact, quite significant indeed, and Miss Marple departed the vicarage with far more questions than answers, though the questions themselves were becoming increasingly specific and increasingly disturbing in their implications. The photograph had troubled Miss Marple far more than she had initially acknowledged, even to herself, and by Monday morning she had determined that she required additional information regarding Reverend Ashford's history prior to his arrival in St. Edmund's Cross. She accomplished this through the careful cultivation of Mrs. Eleanor Webb, who, in addition to her former profession as a seamstress, maintained connections with individuals throughout the surrounding parishes and market towns through her extensive embroidery circles. Eleanor was precisely the sort of woman who believed she was sharing innocuous gossip when in fact she was providing intelligence of considerable significance, and Miss Marple had long ago learned to extract maximum utility from their conversations. "My dear Eleanor," Miss Marple had said during a visit ostensibly concerning the embroidery of altar cloths, "I wonder if you might have any connections in the parish where Reverend Ashford previously served. I'm attempting to determine whether we might borrow some of their hymnal arrangements, and it would be helpful to know who manages such matters there." This was a transparent pretense, but Eleanor was sufficiently occupied with her needlework to accept the explanation without question. However, Eleanor did indeed have a connection, her niece Margaret, who had married a man whose brother served as clerk in a parish some 15 miles distant, where Reverend Ashford had previously held a position. Within 2 days, Eleanor had provided Miss Marple with the information that the previous parish had been situated in a village called Thornfield, and more intriguingly, that Reverend Ashford's departure from that position had been somewhat sudden and had occasioned considerable speculation among the parishioners there. Miss Marple obtained Eleanor's niece's address, and after careful consideration of propriety, composed a letter expressing her interest in learning more about Reverend Ashford's tenure in Thornfield, framing her inquiry as a desire to better understand her new vicar's background and ministerial approach. She received a response within a week, and it was delivered by post to her cottage with a discretion that suggested Eleanor's niece understood the delicate nature of the correspondence. The letter contained information that, while not entirely explicit, was sufficiently suggestive to alter Miss Marple's understanding of recent events considerably. Reverend Ashford had served in Thornfield for 5 years, during which time he had developed a reputation as an eloquent preacher and a conscientious minister. However, approximately 2 years prior to his departure, there had been an incident involving a young woman employed as housekeeper in the vicarage. The woman, whose name was not explicitly stated in the letter, but whom Miss Marple deduced to be Catherine Hartwell based on timing and context, had become pregnant under circumstances that the writer delicately described as morally compromising. The woman had departed the village rather abruptly, and Reverend Ashford had subsequently taken what was characterized as an extended leave of absence for purposes of spiritual reflection. His return to active ministry had coincided with his appointment to St. Edmund's Cross, which had taken place following the retirement of Reverend Blackwell. Margaret, whom Reverend Ashford had married during his period of absence, was described as having appeared from nowhere and having been devotedly attached to her husband in a manner that suggested remarkable commitment to his spiritual redemption. Miss Marple sat in her cottage, the letter in her lap, and allowed the pieces of the puzzle to arrange themselves into a coherent pattern. Catherine Hartwell had borne Reverend Ashford's child, or so the evidence suggested. She had fled Thornfield in pregnancy and had eventually found employment in St. Edmund's Cross, perhaps by coincidence or perhaps by deliberate design. Reverend Ashford had disappeared temporarily and had emerged transformed, with a wife whose devotion seemed to border on obsession. And now, nearly 2 years later, Catherine's coat had appeared on the vicarage gate, a deliberate message, a resurrection of the past, a demand that certain truths be acknowledged. The question that remained was who had left the coat and what they intended by its placement. Miss Marple considered the possibilities carefully. It could not have been Catherine herself. The coat's condition suggested it had been recently retrieved from storage rather than worn during a recent journey. It could be someone who wished to expose Reverend Ashford's indiscretion, though to what purpose remained unclear. Or it could be someone who wished to threaten him, to remind him that his past could be rendered public at any moment. Miss Marple found herself considering Margaret's reaction to the various revelations about Catherine, her tension and fear, her obvious knowledge of things she was reluctant to acknowledge. It was possible, she reflected, that Margaret herself had discovered her husband's past transgression and had taken action to expose it, but Miss Marple found this hypothesis somewhat unconvincing. Margaret's fear seemed to arise not from moral outrage, but from something more personal, more immediate. On Tuesday afternoon, Miss Marple visited the parish register, which was maintained in the vestry of St. Mary's Church. The current register clerk was young Mr. Harrington, who maintained meticulous records and who was generally quite willing to provide information regarding births, deaths, and marriages to anyone who requested it. Miss Marple's ostensible purpose was to verify certain dates related to the Harvest Festival records, but while Mr. Harrington was occupied retrieving those documents, she discreetly examined the marriage registry for the period during which Reverend Ashford had been absent from his previous parish. What she discovered was that Reverend Ashford and Margaret had been married at a small chapel in Scotland, far from the oversight of his former parish, by a minister who was noted as retired and of questionable standing. The marriage certificate bore the date of approximately 18 months prior, which was shortly after Catherine Hartwell had departed St. Edmund's Cross. The implications of this discovery were profound and deeply troubling. It suggested that Margaret had been somehow involved in the resolution of Reverend Ashford's previous crisis, that she had married him during a period when his reputation was compromised and his circumstances were uncertain. It suggested, furthermore, that Margaret might herself have some connection to Catherine Hartwell, or that she had at least possessed sufficient knowledge of the situation to understand its implications. Was Margaret perhaps a friend of Catherine's? Or had she been employed by Reverend Ashford in some capacity, and had she protected him by removing Catherine from the village and marrying him in order to provide respectability? Miss Marple left the church with her mind in considerable turmoil. She had constructed a narrative that seemed to explain many of the peculiarities she had observed, yet it remained incomplete. Catherine's coat on the vicarage gate still demanded explanation. Who had placed it there, and what did they hope to accomplish? And more pressingly, what had become of Catherine Hartwell and the child she had presumably borne? Was the coat perhaps a message of a more sinister nature, a warning, or even a confession? Miss Marple found herself considering possibilities that she had initially dismissed as too dramatic for the quiet reality of a small English village, but she had lived long enough to understand that the greatest tragedies often unfolded in precisely such settings, concealed behind the facade of respectability and routine. The discovery that emerged on Wednesday morning came not from Miss Marple's own investigations, but rather through the unexpected intervention of circumstances, and human nature's irrepressible tendency toward revelation. Young Thomas Whitmore, the postman who had initially discovered the coat on the vicarage gate, had been sorting mail at the post office when he had noticed an unusual parcel addressed to Mrs. Margaret Ashford, bearing the postmark of Manchester and marked as containing medical supplies. Thomas, being of a naturally curious disposition and possessing that particular tendency toward gossip that seemed endemic to individuals in his profession, had mentioned this observation to Mrs. Hartley, who had in turn mentioned it to her daughter, who had mentioned it to her friend, who had eventually related the information to Miss Marple during a chance encounter at the market. Medical supplies from Manchester. The details seemed simultaneously innocuous and laden with significance, and Miss Marple found herself constructing new hypotheses regarding the nature of Margaret Ashford's activities and concerns. She resolved to pay a call upon Dr. Harrison, who served as the village's primary physician and who maintained an office in a converted cottage near the market square. Dr. Harrison was a man of discretion and considerable medical knowledge, and while he would never violate the confidentiality of his patients, he might be induced to discuss general matters of health and medicine if the inquiry were sufficiently delicate and properly framed. The doctor received Miss Marple with the warmth that came from years of acquaintance, and she presented her inquiry as arising from personal concern regarding a hypothetical matter. "Doctor," she said, settling into the chair he offered, "I wonder if you might provide some general guidance regarding a matter of health that has been causing me some puzzlement. I have been aware of certain medications that are sometimes prescribed for purposes related to women's health conditions, and I am attempting to understand whether such medications might be obtained through channels other than the conventional medical establishment. I ask from a purely educational perspective, you understand, though I confess to some personal curiosity." Dr. Harrison, who had known Miss Marple for nearly 3 decades, and who had long since ceased to be surprised by her inquiries, regarded her thoughtfully. "That is rather a specific question," he said carefully. "Might I inquire as to the context of your interest? You are generally not inclined toward medical matters unless there is some particular reason for your curiosity." He folded his hands across his desk, his expression one of benevolent attentiveness. "I have observed that Mrs. Ashford, our new vicar's wife, has been receiving parcels from Manchester marked as containing medical supplies," Miss Marple said. "I confess to wondering whether she might be experiencing some health condition that required treatment, and I was curious regarding what such supplies might contain and whether there was cause for concern regarding her well-being. It is the concern of a parishioner, you understand, motivated purely by Christian charity." This explanation was partially true and partially an elaboration that Miss Marple had carefully constructed to provide sufficient justification for her inquiry without revealing the full extent of her suspicions. Dr. Harrison was silent for a considerable period, his fingers drumming against the desk in a pattern that suggested internal deliberation. "I cannot speak to the specific contents of any parcels Mrs. Ashford may have received," he said finally, "as she has not consulted me regarding her medical needs. However, I can provide you with general information regarding certain categories of medication that are sometimes prescribed for women and that might be obtained through alternative sources if an individual felt that discretion was required." He proceeded to explain, in clinical terms, the nature of various medications that were sometimes used to address complications related to reproductive health, including those used to address infections, those used to manage certain medical conditions, and those used to address complications arising from pregnancies or childbirth. The implications of this information crystallized in Miss Marple's mind with sudden and disturbing clarity. Margaret Ashford had been receiving medical supplies from Manchester, supplies related to women's health and reproductive issues. Catherine Hartwell had become pregnant as a result of her involvement with Reverend Ashford and had departed the village under circumstances suggesting distress and urgency. The timing aligned with reasonable precision, and Miss Marple found herself constructing a narrative that seemed to answer several of the questions that had been troubling her, while simultaneously raising new and far more disturbing possibilities. She left Dr. Harrison's office with her mind in considerable ferment, and she made her way directly to the cottage of Mrs. Eleanor Webb, where she knew Eleanor would be engaged in her embroidery work. Eleanor received her with the pleasure that seemed automatic whenever Miss Marple appeared, and she set aside her needlework to offer tea and attention. "Eleanor," Miss Marple said, declining the tea but settling into the offered chair, "I am about to ask you a question that is somewhat delicate in nature, and I request that you answer with complete honesty, understanding that my inquiry arises from matters of some importance. Did you, during the time that Catherine Hartwell was employed as housekeeper at the vicarage, observe anything that suggested she was in a state of pregnancy or had recently experienced childbirth?" Miss Marple posed the question with characteristic gentleness, yet her eyes remained alert and attentive. Eleanor's needle froze in mid-stitch, and she set down her embroidery with deliberate care. "That is indeed a delicate question, she said slowly, "and I confess to some reluctance in answering, as it involves speculation about matters that are not my business. However, I will say that in the final weeks before Catherine departed the village, there were certain observations one might make regarding her physical condition and circumstances. She wore looser garments than usual, and on one occasion, when I encountered her at the village pump, she appeared to be experiencing some physical distress that seemed consistent with illness, though she insisted nothing was amiss. I also noted that she wore a small wooden cross around her neck and seemed to be in considerable emotional anguish during her final weeks here. I thought perhaps she was experiencing some form of spiritual crisis and felt that she would benefit from speaking with the vicar, but she seemed reluctant to do so." "And after she left the village," Miss Marple inquired gently, "did you hear anything regarding her subsequent circumstances or well-being?" Eleanor hesitated, and Miss Marple observed the subtle tension that crossed her face. "I received a single letter from her," Eleanor said finally, "approximately 3 months after she departed. She wrote from Manchester and indicated that she had found employment there and that she was attempting to rebuild her life. The letter was brief and seemed somewhat melancholic in tone. She thanked me for my kindness during her time in the village and indicated that she hoped never to return as certain circumstances had made her time here unbearable. The letter contained no return address, and I have never heard from her since." Eleanor retrieved a handkerchief from her pocket and dabbed at her eyes. "I always wondered what had caused her such distress that she felt compelled to flee the village entirely. I suspect now that you have discovered something regarding that matter, and I fear the Ken. Owledge is troubling you considerably." Miss Marple remained silent for several moments, processing this latest revelation and integrating it with the information she had previously gathered. Catherine Hartwell had indeed been pregnant when she departed St. Edmund's Cross. She had gone to Manchester, where she had given birth, and she had subsequently attempted to rebuild her life in that city. Yet the coat had returned to the vicarage gate, which suggested that Catherine herself, or someone connected to her circumstances, had determined that certain truths needed to be exposed. Miss Marple found herself considering the most disturbing possibility of all, that someone, possibly Margaret Ashford herself, had gone to Manchester to retrieve Catherine's coat and had deliberately returned it to the vicarage as a form of threat or accusation. But the question remained as to why such a gesture would be made and what end it was intended to serve. Was it possible that something had happened to Catherine Hartwell, that she had died or disappeared under circumstances that demanded exposure? Or was the coat itself a message of a different sort entirely, one that spoke of secrets, of children born in shame, of lives disrupted and destroyed? Miss Marple's next course of action required considerable deliberation, for she had accumulated sufficient information to construct a coherent hypothesis regarding recent events, yet she lacked the definitive proof that would be required to expose the truth to public scrutiny or official authority. She was aware that accusations made without sufficient evidence were not merely damaging but potentially actionable, and she had no desire to bring ruin upon innocent parties through careless speculation. Yet she was equally convinced that something profoundly wrong had occurred, something that demanded illumination and accountability. Therefore, on Thursday morning, she determined upon a course of action that was somewhat unconventional, but which she believed would yield the truth she required. She composed a letter addressed to Reverend Ashford, requesting a private meeting at the vicarage to discuss matters of spiritual significance relating to the sacrament of confession and the nature of redemption. She framed the letter in such a manner as to suggest she was seeking guidance regarding her own spiritual concerns, though the subtext was sufficiently clear to anyone possessed of reasonable intelligence that she was inviting him to acknowledge certain truths that remained unspoken between them. She sent the letter through the post, and she waited to observe his reaction when it arrived. The vicar's response came the following afternoon in the form of a personal visit to Miss Marple's cottage. She was working in her garden when Reverend Ashford appeared at the gate, his expression a mixture of apprehension and resignation that suggested he had anticipated some form of confrontation and had determined that direct engagement was preferable to continued evasion. Miss Marple invited him inside, with the courtesy she extended to all visitors, and they settled into her sitting room with tea and the particular formality that seemed to accompany conversations of consequence. "You have discovered something regarding Catherine Hartwell," Reverend Ashford said without preamble, his voice steady though his hands betrayed his inner turmoil by their trembling. "I have known since the coat appeared that this moment would eventually arrive. I have been attempting to determine how to respond and what, if anything, I might do to prevent further harm." He paused, his gaze fixed upon his folded hands. "But perhaps prevention is no longer possible. Perhaps the truth is simply waiting to emerge, and I have merely been delaying its arrival rather than genuinely concealing it." Miss Marple remained silent, allowing the space between them to encourage further revelation. Silence, she had learned, was sometimes the most effective tool available to anyone seeking truth, for most people found silence unbearable and would rush to fill it with admissions and explanations they would otherwise have carefully guarded. "Catherine was employed in my previous parish," Reverend Ashford continued slowly. "She was a young woman of considerable gentleness and limited prospects. My ministry in Thornfield had become somewhat stale, and I had begun to feel the weight of my responsibilities in ways that were not entirely appropriate for a man in my position. Catherine represented something that I told myself was merely human connection, but which was in truth a profound betrayal of my vows and my calling. When she became pregnant, I was forced to confront the consequences of my actions, and I proved to be a coward. Rather than acknowledging my responsibility and addressing the situation with courage and integrity, I allowed her to depart the village without assistance or protection. I permitted her to carry the burden of our transgression entirely alone." "And when you came to St. Edmund's Cross," Miss Marple asked gently, "did you not consider attempting to locate her, to offer assistance?" "I did more than consider it," the vicar replied, and his voice now contained an edge of bitterness. "I attempted to do so. I discovered that Catherine had gone to Manchester. and I travelled there myself on several occasions with the intention of finding her. It was during one of these journeys that I met Margaret. She was a nurse at the hospital where Catherine had sought treatment following the birth of our child. Margaret had cared for Catherine during a time of considerable illness and had learned of Catherine's circumstances. When I appeared in Manchester, ostensibly seeking employment references for Catherine, Margaret recognized me immediately as the man who had abandoned her patient and whom Catherine had described in terms that were not entirely forgiving. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had become barely audible. Margaret offered me a choice. She could assist me in locating Catherine and facilitating my acceptance of parental responsibility, or she could ensure that Catherine's story became known throughout the medical community and beyond, bringing ruin upon my reputation and any possibility of future ministry. She indicated that the choice was mine, but that she would not tolerate my abandonment of Catherine and the child being left unresolved and unacknowledged. "And what choice did you make?" Miss Marple asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "I married Margaret," Reverend Ashford said simply. "She required that I accept her protection and her silence, and in exchange she agreed to assist me in establishing a new life in a new parish where my past would not be known. She has been, in some respects, my salvation. In other respects, she has been my jailer. We have been bound together by the secret we share and by the knowledge that should I ever attempt to expose her blackmail, she possesses sufficient information to destroy us both." He looked up now, and his eyes held a quality of profound despair. "But the coat," he said. "The coat suggests that someone has discovered what we have been attempting to conceal. Someone knows about Catherine and the child, and someone has decided that the truth must be exposed." "Do you know who?" Miss Marple asked carefully. "Do you have any notion of who might have retrieved Catherine's coat from Manchester and returned it to your gate?" Reverend Ashford was silent for a considerable period, and when he finally spoke, his words came with difficulty. "I suspect it was Catherine herself," he said, "or perhaps her daughter. The child would be nearly 6 years old now. Catherine wrote to me once, just after the birth, and she informed me that I had fathered a daughter. The letter was brief and contained no request for assistance or acknowledgement. It was merely notification of fact. I have wondered over the years whether Catherine has told this daughter about her father, and if so, what she might have told her. I have wondered whether the child might one day attempt to contact me or to make her existence known." He looked directly at Miss Marple now, and his expression held a terrible mixture of hope and dread. "Do you know what has become of them? Have you discovered where Catherine and the child are now?" Miss Marple rose and walked to her window, gazing out upon her garden with the thoughtful intensity that generally preceded her most significant observations. "I do not yet possess definitive knowledge regarding their current whereabouts," she said finally, turning back to face the vicar. "However, I am convinced that the appearance of Catherine's coat is a deliberate communication. Someone wishes you to know that your past cannot remain buried indefinitely, and someone wishes you to take responsibility for the consequences of your actions. I suspect that this someone may be Catherine herself, or possibly her daughter, though I cannot yet determine what specific outcome they hope to achieve through this revelation. What I can tell you with certainty is that concealment has failed, Reverend Ashford. The truth is emerging, whether you choose to acknowledge it or not. The question that now confronts you is not how to prevent its exposure, but rather how to respond to it with integrity and courage. The week that followed, Reverend Ashford's confession was marked by a peculiar quality of tension that seemed to permeate the entire village of St. Edmund's Cross, though most of its inhabitants remained unaware of the true source of their collective unease. Miss Marple observed this phenomenon with her characteristic attention to detail, noting how conversations became more guarded, how glances lingered longer than necessary, and how the ordinary rhythms of village life seemed subtly disrupted by some unnamed anxiety. The truth, she understood, had a way of announcing itself through 1,000 small disturbances in the social fabric, even before it was explicitly articulated or publicly acknowledged. The coat remained the central mystery, however, and Miss Marple found herself increasingly determined to discover Who had made the deliberate choice to resurrect Catherine Hartwell's forgotten garment and place it so carefully upon the vicarage gate? She had begun to construct a secondary theory that seemed to address certain inconsistencies in her previous assumptions. While she had considered the possibility that Catherine herself or her daughter had retrieved the coat, she had not adequately examined the mechanics of such an operation. How would Catherine, living in Manchester and working to support herself and a young child, have managed to return to St. Edmund's Cross to retrieve a coat that had been left in the vicarage years earlier? And how would she have known that the coat had been preserved rather than discarded? These practical considerations suggested that someone else, someone with knowledge of the coat's location and accessibility, must have been involved in its retrieval and replacement. This brought Miss Marple's attention back to Margaret Ashford, who had been present in the village long enough to have established certain connections and who possessed the knowledge and opportunity to execute such a plan. On Monday morning, Miss Marple made a deliberate visit to the market square, where she positioned herself in such a manner as to observe the comings and goings of the vicarage. She was rewarded for her patience when, shortly after midday, Margaret Ashford appeared, ostensibly making purchases at various shops, but in reality Miss Marple suspected, conducting some form of reconnaissance or communication. The younger woman seemed distracted and anxious, her movements suggesting a person operating under considerable emotional strain. Miss Marple followed her at a discreet distance as Margaret made her way from the market toward the outskirts of the village, eventually arriving at a small cottage that had been let to a young woman several months prior. Miss Marple recognized the cottage as belonging to Miss Sarah Winters, a former teacher who had relocated to St. Edmund's Cross following a personal tragedy and who maintained a somewhat withdrawn existence, rarely engaging with the broader village society. This discovery proved illuminating, for it suggested a connection between Margaret and Sarah Winters that had previously escaped Miss Marple's notice. She resolved to make the acquaintance of Miss Winters in a manner that would appear natural and unplanned, and she accomplished this on the following afternoon by arranging to encounter her at the village library. Sarah Winters proved to be a woman of perhaps 35 years, possessed of considerable intelligence and a certain wariness in her manner that suggested she had experienced some form of significant disappointment or loss. When Miss Marple engaged her in conversation regarding her reasons for relocating to St. Edmund's Cross, Sarah responded with polite evasion, suggesting only that she had sought a quieter environment in which to recover from certain life circumstances. However, when Miss Marple subtly introduced the subject of Catherine Hartwell and the mysterious appearance of her coat, she observed a significant reaction in Sarah's demeanor. The younger woman's hands trembled slightly, and her eyes widened in a manner that suggested both fear and recognition. "You know something regarding Catherine Hartwell," Miss Marple said gently, abandoning her indirect approach in favor of directness. "I'm not asking this out of mere curiosity, Miss Winters, though I confess to possessing that quality in considerable measure. I am asking because I believe Catherine's circumstances and her well-being are matters of genuine significance, and I suspect that you may have information that would illuminate those circumstances." Sarah Winters was silent for a considerable period, her fingers gripping the edge of the library table with apparent force. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "Catherine is my sister," she said. "My older sister. We have been estranged for many years, though we have recently reconnected. She came to St. Edmund's Cross last month, after an absence of nearly 6 years. She told me that she had been living in Manchester, working as a nurse at a hospital, and that she had a daughter, my niece, whom I had never known existed. She told me about Reverend Ashford and about the circumstances that had driven her from this village." Sarah paused, her voice becoming increasingly unsteady. "She told me that she had never truly recovered from her treatment here, from being abandoned and cast aside as though she were of no consequence. She told me that she had come to believe that her daughter deserved to know her father, to understand her lineage and family connections. And she told me that she needed my help in forcing Reverend Ashford to acknowledge what he had done." "And the coat?" Miss Marple asked. "The coat that appeared on the vicarage gate?" "That was Catherine's coat," Sarah confirmed. "She had kept it all these years, preserved it as a kind of reminder of the life she had lived before everything changed. She wanted Reverend Ashford to see it, and to understand that she had not disappeared, that she had not simply accepted his rejection and moved on. She wanted him to know that she had endured, that she had survived, and that she would no longer allow him to pretend that she and her daughter did not exist. She placed the coat herself, one evening when she was certain no one would observe her. She wanted him to find it, and to be forced to confront what he had done. Sarah's eyes now fillet with tears. But something went wrong. Catherine was struck by a motor car on the Manchester road 3 days after she left the coat. She was hospitalized, and she suffered injuries that were quite serious. She is recovering now, but slowly, and she has been compelled to remain in Manchester to receive proper medical care. Miss Marple absorbed this information with the sensation of pieces clicking into place with sudden and terrible clarity. Catherine had not disappeared. She had merely been silenced by circumstance and injury. And Margaret Ashford, aware of Catherine's presence and her intentions, had taken action to conceal the truth and to protect her husband from the consequences of his past transgression. Margaret Ashford knew that Catherine was here, Miss Marple said, comprehension dawning. She knew of Catherine's plan to expose the truth, and she determined to prevent it by removing the evidence and discrediting the narrative. Did she cause the accident that injured Catherine? I don't know, Sarah said, her voice trembling. Catherine cannot remember the accident clearly. She was crossing the road in the evening, and she was struck from behind. The driver did not stop. There were no witnesses, or if there were, they did not come forward. The police investigated minimally and concluded that it was likely a traveller passing through rather than anyone from the local area. But Catherine harbours suspicions, and so do I. Margaret Ashford has connections in Manchester through her previous employment as a nurse. It would not have been impossible for her to arrange for Catherine to be silenced through deliberate violence. Sarah looked directly at Miss Marple now, and her expression held a quality of desperate hope. That is why the coat remained on the gate, Miss Marple. That is why Catherine's message was not fully communicated, because before she could compel. To what she had begun, she was struck down. And now I fear that if Reverend Ashford learns the full truth, that Catherine and our niece are in Manchester and vulnerable, he may feel compelled to protect his secret by any means necessary. Margaret has already proven herself capable of violence. What might she not do if she felt truly threatened? The revelation that Catherine Hartwell had been struck down by a motor car under circumstances that suggested possible deliberate violence transformed Miss Marple's understanding of the situation from a matter of moral transgression and concealment into something considerably more grave and potentially criminal in nature. She sat across from Sarah Winters in the quiet of the library, allowing the implications of this disclosure to settle upon her with the weight they deserved. If Margaret Ashford had indeed orchestrated Catherine's accident, then she had crossed a threshold that elevated her actions from blackmail and manipulation into the realm of attempted murder, or at minimum, grievous bodily harm inflicted with deliberate intent. The question that now confronted Miss Marple was not merely how to expose the truth, but how to do so in a manner that would protect Catherine and her daughter from further harm, while simultaneously ensuring that justice was adequately served. Miss Winters, Miss Marple said carefully, I must ask you several questions of considerable importance, and I require that you answer with complete honesty. First, does Reverend Ashford know that Catherine is here in the village, or that she is in Manchester and has been injured? I believe he suspects that Catherine may be in the area, Sarah replied, but I do not think he knows definitively that she is my sister, or that she has been injured. Margaret has maintained strict control over information reaching him, or so I gather from the brief conversation. I have overheard between them when they did not realize I was present. Sarah hesitated, then continued. I have been attempting to determine how best to inform him of Catherine's circumstances without endangering her further, but I confess to considerable uncertainty regarding the appropriate course of action. Second, Miss Marple continued, has Catherine been able to provide you with any concrete evidence regarding the accident? Is there anything that would suggest deliberate causation rather than mere misfortune? Sarah considered this question with evident care. Catherine recalls that before being struck, she had the impression that a motor car was following her at considerable speed. She remembers thinking it odd that the driver did not slow down or attempt to avoid her. She was struck from behind with sufficient force to render her unconscious. When she awakened in the hospital, she had sustained a fractured leg, broken ribs, and a concussion. The police investigation concluded that it was likely an accident caused by a reckless driver. But Catherine has always harbored doubts. She believed, or perhaps knew with greater certainty than she was willing to articulate, that the accident was not accidental at all, but rather a deliberate attempt to silence her. Miss Marple rose and walked to the library window, her mind working through the logical implications of what she had been told. Margaret Ashford had demonstrated considerable capacity for manipulation and deception. She had blackmailed Reverend Ashford into marriage as a condition of her silence regarding his past transgression. She had attempted to conceal Catherine's existence and the circumstances of her departure from the village. And now, apparently, she had taken direct action to eliminate the threat that Catherine's reappearance posed to her carefully constructed life. But Margaret had made a critical error, one that Miss Marple suspected she had not fully anticipated. She had failed to completely silence Catherine. The young woman had survived the accident, and she had recovered sufficiently to remain in contact with her sister. Furthermore, Catherine had left behind the coat, which had served as the opening through which truth had begun to emerge. "Miss Winters," Miss Marple said, turning back to face her, "I am going to take action regarding this matter, and I require your assistance and your complete cooperation. However, I must warn you that what I am about to propose involves a degree of deception and manipulation that may trouble your conscience. Nevertheless, I believe it is the only course of action that will adequately protect Catherine and her daughter, while simultaneously ensuring that justice is served." She paused, allowing Sarah sufficient time to prepare herself for what would follow. "I intend to set a deliberate trap for Margaret Ashford, one that will force her to reveal the extent of her knowledge regarding Catherine's accident and the deliberateness of her actions. To accomplish this, I will require you to deliver a message to Reverend Ashford, suggesting that Catherine has contacted you and that she intends to publicly expose the truth regarding her past relationship with him and the existence of his daughter. I will further require that you suggest Catherine's location in Manchester and the name of the hospital where she is currently receiving treatment, but that will endanger Catherine further," Sarah protested, her face draining of color. "If Margaret learns that Catherine is in contact with us and intends to expose the truth—" "On the contrary," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "it will accomplish precisely the opposite. You see, Miss Winters, Margaret's violence toward Catherine arose from her belief that Catherine posed an immediate and direct threat to her security and her marriage. Should Reverend Ashford learn the truth about Catherine's accident and about Margaret's likely involvement in it, Margaret's position would become untenable. She would no longer be the protector and keeper of secrets, she would become the perpetrator of violence. Reverend Ashford, whatever his moral failings, is not a man inclined toward complicity in criminal acts. Once he understands the full extent of Margaret's actions, his loyalty to her will crumble and her leverage over him will evaporate. Therefore, by bringing the truth to light, we will actually render Catherine safer, not more vulnerable, for we will have removed Margaret's motivation for further violence." Sarah remained visibly uncertain, but after considerable deliberation and reassurance from Miss Marple regarding the soundness of her reasoning, she consented to deliver the message as instructed. She agreed to visit Reverend Ashford at the vicarage the following evening, and to inform him that Catherine had made contact, that she was alive and recovering from her injuries, and that she intended to make her circumstances and her daughter's existence publicly known unless Reverend Ashford took immediate responsibility for his past actions and his present obligations. She was to indicate that Catherine could be reached at St. Matthew's Hospital in Manchester, and that she was prepared to meet with her daughter's father if he was willing to do so. The following morning, Miss Marple made her own appearance at the vicarage, ostensibly to discuss the flower arrangements for the upcoming Sunday service. Margaret answered the door with her customary courtesy, though Miss Marple detected a certain brittleness beneath the politeness. a tightness around the eyes that suggested the younger woman had not slept well. Miss Marple settled herself in the sitting-room d'Abois, her customary grace, and began what appeared to be innocent conversation regarding the state of the garden and the anticipated blooms for the season. "I noticed your garden has undergone considerable revision in recent months," Miss Marple observed mildly. "You have removed several plantings and disturbed certain areas of soil. I do hope you have not excavated anything of archaeological significance. One hears such stories about villages and the secrets their earth contains." She watched carefully as Margaret's hands trembled slightly and as a faint flush crept up her neck. "Secrets," Miss Marple continued with apparent innocence, "can be quite burdensome, don't you find? I have often observed that people who harbor significant secrets often experience considerable physical manifestations of their emotional distress. Sleeplessness, trembling hands, a certain tension in the shoulders and jaw. Such things are remarkably consistent indicators of internal turmoil." Margaret stood abruptly, her composure fracturing visibly. "I don't appreciate your insinuations, Miss Marple," she said, her voice sharp with barely contained anger. "If you have something to say to me, I suggest you say it directly rather than speaking in these cryptic riddles." Her reaction, Miss Marple noted, was precisely what she had anticipated, the response of someone whose carefully maintained facade had begun to crack under pressure and whose desperation was beginning to override her judgment. "Very well," Miss Marple said calmly. "I believe you caused Catherine Hartwell to be struck by a motor car in Manchester in an attempt to silence her. I believe you did this because you understood that Catherine's reappearance and her intention to expose her relationship with your husband and the existence of his daughter posed a threat to your marriage and your social position. I believe you orchestrated this violence deliberately and with conscious intent to cause serious bodily harm. And I believe that when Reverend Ashford learns these truths, your marriage and your security will collapse entirely." Miss Marple observed the transformation that occurred in Margaret's face as she spoke, watched as shock gave way to fury and then to a terrible, desperate understanding. "The question that now remains, Mrs. Ashford, is what you intend to do with this knowledge." Margaret Ashford stood frozen in the center of the sitting room, her face a portrait of conflicting emotions: fury, desperation, defiance, and beneath it all a profound and terrible despair. Miss Marple remained seated with her characteristic composure, her hands folded precisely in her lap, her expression one of gentle observation rather than triumph or condemnation. She understood that this moment represented a critical juncture, one in which Margaret's response would determine not merely her own fate, but potentially the future well-being of several individuals whose lives had become irrevocably entangled by circumstance and human transgression. "You cannot prove anything," Margaret said finally, her voice low and controlled, though the effort required to maintain this control was evident in every line of her body. "Catherine's accident was investigated by the police and concluded to be an unfortunate incident involving a reckless driver. There are no witnesses, no evidence, no connection between myself and the motor car that struck her. You are an elderly woman constructing elaborate theories based on suspicion and inference, nothing more. No court would credit your accusations, and no authority would take action based solely on the speculations of a retired spinster with an excessive imagination." She paused, and when she spoke again, her tone had shifted to something resembling contempt. "You are meddling in matters that do not concern you, Miss Marple, and you are doing so based on nothing more substantial than gossip and assumption." "You are quite correct," Miss Marple acknowledged calmly. "I possess no concrete evidence that would satisfy a court of law or convince a police investigation. However, I do not believe your response demonstrates the understanding of your actual predicament that would be most advantageous to you at this present moment. You see, Mrs. Ashford, whether or not I can prove your involvement in Catherine's accident is now quite irrelevant. What matters is that Reverend Ashford is, at this very moment, being informed of Catherine's survival and recovery, of her intention to expose the truth regarding their past relationship and the existence of his daughter, and of her location in Manchester. What matters is that your husband will soon have to confront the fact that the woman he abandoned years ago has endured, has survived, and has refused to permit her suffering to be forgotten or minimized. And what matters most significantly is that he will come to understand the true nature of the woman he has married, not as his protector and savior, as you have presented yourself, but as someone capable of violence, of attempted murder, of the deliberate infliction of suffering upon the vulnerable. Margaret's composure cracked visibly at these words, and she sank into the nearest chair as though her legs had suddenly ceased to support her weight. "He will leave me," she said, her voice now barely audible. "He will leave me and go to her, and everything I have sacrificed, everything I have endured, will be rendered meaningless. He will discover that I am not the woman he believed me to be, that I am capable of darkness and cruelty he cannot reconcile with his faith and his calling. I will become precisely what I have always feared, abandoned, discarded, alone." "Shh!" E looked up now, and her eyes held a quality of profound anguish. "Do you understand what you have done, Miss Marple? Do you comprehend the devastation you are orchestrating in the name of your precious truth?" Miss Marple regarded the younger woman with an expression that mingled compassion with an absolute refusal to be moved from her moral position. "I understand perfectly," she said quietly. "I understand that you will suffer consequences for your actions, that your marriage will be tested in ways that may prove insurmountable, and that your life will be disrupted and fundamentally altered. I understand this because I have lived long enough to observe that truth, when it emerges, invariably disrupts and damages the constructed narratives by which we have ordered our lives. However, I must remind you that you are not the victim in this scenario, Mrs. Ashford. Catherine Hartwell is the victim, a young woman who was seduced and abandoned by a man in a position of spiritual authority, who bore his child alone and in shame, who has struggled for years to rebuild some semblance of dignity and security, and who was subsequently struck down by a motor car driven by someone who wished to ensure her silence. That is the actual tragedy, Mrs. Ashford, not your personal disappointment or your fear of abandonment. You are sanctimonious and cruel," Margaret said, her voice rising now, her carefully maintained control finally shattering entirely. "You sit in judgment upon those of us who are actually living, actually struggling, actually attempting to construct some form of meaningful existence from the wreckage of our circumstances. You wrap yourself in the garments of righteousness and call it wisdom, but it is nothing more than the smugness of someone who has never truly suffered, who has never been desperate enough to contemplate actions they know to be wrong but which seem necessary for survival." She rose abruptly, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Yes, I orchestrated Catherine's accident. Yes, I arranged for her to be struck down because I understood that she posed a threat not merely to my marriage, but to my very existence. For if she revealed the truth about my husband's past, if she exposed his weakness and his capacity for abandonment, then what did that make me? A woman so desperate for security that she had married a man she knew to be morally compromised, bound myself to him through blackmail and threat, and then compounded my transgression by attempting to eliminate the woman whose existence threatened my constructed security." The confession hung in the silence between them like a physical presence, and Miss Marple recognized that she had finally achieved what she had set out to accomplish, not merely the exposure of truth, but the forced acknowledgement of Margaret's culpability and the recognition of her own moral degradation. However, Miss Marple also understood that such moments of confession and self-awareness, while necessary, were rarely sufficient in themselves to produce genuine transformation or redemption. They were merely the beginning of a process that would require considerable pain and adjustment for all parties involved. "What will you do now?" Margaret asked, and the defiance had drained entirely from her voice, leaving behind only exhaustion and a kind of hollow resignation. "Will you go to the police? Will you inform my husband? Will you reveal all of this to the village and ensure that I am cast out as a pariah, that I am destroyed utterly and completely? Is that the justice you seek, Miss Marple? The complete and utter annihilation of my life and my prospects?" She moved to the window and gazed out upon the garden, upon the disturbed patches of earth where she had attempted to conceal evidence of her emotional turmoil and her desperation. "I have spent the last 6 years attempting to construct a life that would feel stable and permanent. I have attempted to be a good wife, a dutiful member of this community, a woman of virtue and propriety, and in doing so, I have become capable of violence and cruelty that I barely recognize as emanating from my own being. I have become someone I despise." Miss Marple rose and moved to stand beside Margaret at the window. "That recognition," she said quietly, "is perhaps the most important thing you have said, for it suggests that you possess a capacity for genuine moral understanding that is not entirely corrupted by your actions and your justifications for them. The question that now confronts you is not what I will do, Mrs. Ashford, but rather what you will do. Will you permit the truth to emerge and attempt to face its consequences with whatever grace and acceptance you can muster, or will you compound your transgression by attempting further deception and concealment? Will you attempt to silence me, or will you accept that the truth has already begun to unravel, regardless of your wishes or intentions? The final section of the coat left on the vicarage gate must bring all threads together with the precision and grace that characterizes a true Agatha Christie mystery. Here is section 12. The autumn rain fell gently upon St. Edmund's Cross on the following Sunday, as though the village itself were weeping for the secrets that had been exposed and the lives that would be forever altered by their revelation. Miss Marple sat in her customary pew at St. Mary's Church, observing with her characteristically detached attention the various parishioners who had assembled for the morning service. The congregation was notably smaller than usual, for word had spread through the village regarding the resignation of Reverend Ashford, and the accompanying rumors of scandal and transgression. Those who had come seemed uncertain whether their presence demonstrated loyal support for the established church or morbid curiosity regarding the personal dramas of their spiritual leaders. Miss Marple recognized in their confusion the eternal tension that existed between propriety and prurient interest, between the desire to maintain social stability and the irrepressible human appetite for revelation and drama. Reverend Ashford did not appear at the pulpit. Instead, a temporary replacement had been arranged, a visiting clergyman of advanced years who delivered a sermon on the nature of human fallibility and divine forgiveness, with a delicacy that suggested he had been adequately briefed regarding the circumstances of his temporary colleague's departure. Miss Marple found herself considering whether forgiveness, genuine forgiveness rather than mere social pretense, was actually possible in cases where transgression had been as profound and deliberate as those perpetrated by both Reverend Ashford and his wife. She had lived long enough to understand that forgiveness was often a luxury extended primarily to those who possessed sufficient social standing and charm to render their redemption palatable to society at large. Catherine Hartwell, by contrast, had received little forgiveness or social rehabilitation during her years of suffering and isolation. The events of the preceding days had unfolded with remarkable swiftness once the mechanisms of truth had been set in motion. Reverend Ashford, confronted by Sarah Winters with evidence of Catherine's survival and her intention to publicly expose their past relationship, had experienced what Miss Marple could only characterize as a genuine spiritual crisis. He had retreated to his study for an entire evening and had emerged the following morning with an appearance of profound aged weariness, having apparently spent the night in prayer and deliberation. He had informed his wife that he intended to resign his position and to travel to Manchester to meet with Catherine and to acknowledge his daughter. He had made it clear that he could no longer continue to benefit from the concealment of his transgression or to remain complicit in Margaret's increasingly desperate attempts to preserve their marriage through deception and violence. Margaret's response had been to confess to the police regarding her involvement in arranging Catherine's accident. She had done so voluntarily and without legal counsel, providing detailed information regarding how she had hired a local driver through intermediaries, how she had orchestrated his presence on the Manchester road at the precise moment Catherine would be crossing, and how she had arranged for his subsequent disappearance from the village to eliminate evidence of the conspiracy. The confession had been thorough and damning, and it had resulted in formal charges of attempted murder and conspiracy. Margaret had been remanded into custody pending trial, and she faced the prospect of significant imprisonment for her actions. Yet what troubled Miss Marple most profoundly was not the legal resolution of the matter, but rather its human dimension. She had received a letter from Catherine Hartwell, delivered through Miss Sarah Winters, expressing gratitude for Miss Marple's role in exposing the truth, while simultaneously articulating a complex mixture of emotions regarding her daughter's father and his impending entry into their lives. Catherine wrote that she had harbored no desire for Reverend Ashford's company or continued involvement in her life, that she had sought only acknowledgement of her daughter's existence and some minimal acceptance of parental responsibility. She wrote that she had spent 6 years rebuilding herself and her life, that she had found purpose and dignity in her work as a nurse, and that she harbored no illusions regarding the potential for genuine family connection with a man who had demonstrated such profound capacity for abandonment and self-deception. Yet Catherine had also written that she would permit her daughter to meet her father, that she would allow the child to make her own determinations regarding what relationship, if any, she wished to maintain with him. She had written that she believed in the possibility of human growth and redemption, though she no longer held particular hope that Reverend Ashford would achieve either. Most significantly, she had written to Miss Marple that she understood now that the coat left on the vicarage gate had been both an accusation and a beginning, that it had represented not merely a demand for recognition but a deliberate choice to cease hiding, to cease allowing her silence to be purchased through concealment and shame. 2 months after the events of that autumn, Miss Marple received a visitor at her cottage. It was Reverend Timothy Ashford, though he no longer bore the title of Reverend, for his resignation from the church had been accepted and his ecclesiastical credentials had been formally withdrawn pending an ecclesiastical inquiry into his conduct. He appeared considerably diminished by recent events, his bearing less confident, his eyes holding a quality of permanent sadness that suggested he had been fundamentally altered by confrontation with his own capacity for moral failure. He had come, he explained, to thank Miss Marple for her role in exposing the truth and to attempt to explain, if not to justify, his past actions and his response to their exposure. "I have met my daughter," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Aim is Eleanor, after Catherine's mother. Shh! E is 6 years old, bright and observant, and possessed of a directness that I find both humbling and deeply painful. She asked me why I had abandoned her mother, and I found that I could not provide an answer that satisfied either her or myself. I explained that I had been weak, that I had been frightened, that I had failed in my responsibilities as both a minister and a man. She told me that weakness was not an excuse and that I should have done better." From the mouth of a 6-year-old child, Miss Marple, came a judgment more profound and more just than any I could have imposed upon myself. He paused, his hands trembling slightly. "Catherine has permitted me limited contact with Eleanor, supervised and conditional. I have accepted this arrangement without complaint, for I understand that I have forfeited any right to make demands regarding the terms of our relationship." Miss Marple listened to this narrative with the particular attention she reserved for moments of genuine human transformation. "And your wife?" she inquired gently. "Have you maintained any connection with her?" "I have visited her in prison," Reverend Ashford replied, "not out of any lingering affection or obligation, but because I believe that she too deserves the opportunity to confront what she has become, and to contemplate whether redemption might be possible. We have spoken very little, and our conversations have been marked by considerable awkwardness and pain, but I believe that she is beginning, slowly and with difficulty, to recognize that her actions arose not from a genuine desire to protect me or our marriage, but from her own desperate need for security and control. Whether that recognition will ultimately lead to genuine remorse and change, I cannot determine, but I believe the possibility exists." After Reverend Ashford departed, Miss Marple remained in her sitting room for a consi. Terrible period, reflecting upon the resolution of the mystery that had begun with a coat left upon a vicarage gate. She understood that the truth, having emerged, had not solved all of the problems it had revealed. Catherine Hartwell would bear the psychological scars of her abandonment and her injury for the remainder of her life. Reverend Ashford would exist in a state of diminished circumstances, stripped of his calling and his respectability. Margaret Ashford would spend years in confinement, contemplating the consequences of her attempts to control destiny through violence and deception. And little Eleanor Ashford would grow up understanding that her existence had been born of transgression, and that her father's acknowledgement of her was predicated upon exposure and compulsion rather than genuine love and acceptance. Yet Miss Marple also understood that the alternative to exposure would have been far worse. Catherine would have remained silenced and invisible. Her daughter would have grown up without knowledge of her own heritage, and Reverend Ashford would have continued to perform his ministry while harboring a secret that corrupted the very foundation of his calling. Margaret would have persisted in her desperate attempt to maintain a marriage built upon blackmail and concealment, and she would have remained subject to the psychological torture of constant fear regarding discovery. The exposure of truth, while painful, had at least provided the possibility of genuine transformation and the opportunity for each individual to confront the consequences of their actions and to determine, from that confrontation, what form their lives might take going forward. As Christmas approached, St. Edmund's Cross gradually returned to its customary rhythms and patterns. A new vicar was appointed, a married man of modest temperament and genuine pastoral compassion. Margaret A. Ashford's trial resulted in a conviction on the charge of attempted murder, with sentencing to 10 years' imprisonment, a judgment that seemed to satisfy few people, but which represented society's attempt to balance accountability with mercy. Sarah Winters remained in the village and gradually became better integrated into its social fabric, her connection to the events of the autumn lending her a certain notoriety that eventually transformed into acceptance. Miss Marple returned to her quiet life of gardening and observation, though those who knew her well understood that she remained perpetually vigilant, watching and listening to the small dramas that unfolded within the village community. On the final day of the year, Miss Marple received a package from Manchester. It contained a new coat, grey wool with pearl buttons identical to the original, and enclosed within it was a letter from Catherine Hartwell. Catherine wrote that she had purchased the coat as a symbol of renewal and transformation, that she wore it as a reminder that the past, however painful, could be transcended through courage and dignity. She wrote that Eleanor now knew the full story of her origins, and that the child had demonstrated remarkable wisdom in her response, expressing sorrow that her father had suffered so greatly as to make such choices, while simultaneously maintaining clear boundaries regarding the nature of their relationship. Most significantly, Catherine wrote that she harbored no bitterness toward Miss Marple, that she understood that the exposure of truth, however uncomfortable and painful, had been ultimately necessary and ultimately just. Miss Marple placed the coat carefully in her wardrobe and resolved to wear it on occasions when she felt the need to be reminded of certain fundamental truths about human nature and the power of truth to transform lives. She understood that in her long life, she had observed countless mysteries, both great and small, and that the solution to each mystery invariably revealed something profound about the human capacity for both goodness and transgression, for both cruelty and compassion. The coat left on the vicarage gate had been merely one such mystery among many, but it had illuminated certain truths that seemed to her eternally significant, that silence and concealment inevitably breed corruption, that truth, however delayed and however painful, ultimately prevails, and that even in the darkest circumstances, the possibility of genuine transformation and redemption remains available to those possessed of sufficient courage and humility to confront what they have become.